So again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this masterclass with Professor Robinson. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll do a brief introduction and then turn it over to Professor Robinson. In this session, the Self-Organizing Periphery with Professor James Robinson, you will learn about his research using data on the organization and behavior of Colombian paramilitary groups. A little bit about Professor Robinson as Institute Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. He is guiding the Institute's research agenda, engaging the international academic and practitioner community through the Pearson Global Forum, and setting the curriculum for the next generation of leaders in scholarships. He is the co-author of Why Nations Fail and the Narrow Corridor. Professor, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, and welcome to everybody. Yeah, I changed the topic of my talk because we've been doing this work on the impact of bombing by the Germans. You know, there's amazingly good bombing data during the Second World War in England looking at the impact on inequality and the kind of long run political dynamics. But then I thought, like, when did I ever meet an English student at the Harris School? I don't think I ever, but there's all these Latin American students. So I refocused and I'm going to talk about this other project, which we just, even though it's been going on for 10 years, I can tell you a little bit about the history. We just have some results on. So I've been working in Colombia. Oh my gosh, I first went to Colombia in 1992. Pablo Escobar escaped from prison when I was there, from his phony prison in Medellin when I was in Colombia for the first time. And I've been teaching every summer at the University of the Andes since 1994. So I have a summer school. So I have a lot of connections in Colombia, and I've done a lot of research on Colombia over the years. So this is just a recent, I'm always trying to disengage from doing research on Colombia, but my students won't let me. So this is the outcome of, so what should I do? Let me share my screen instead of rambling on endlessly. And this is okay. All right, you can see that. Yeah, this is joint work. The title changes every an hour. This is the first time I've ever talked about this project, actually, but I've been working on it for 10 years, since I was on sabbatical in Bogota, actually, in 2011, 2012. And it's called the Self-Organizing Periphery. You'll see what it's about. And it's joint work with Maria Angelica Bautista, who's actually my colleague here at the Harris School, and Juan Sebastian Galan. Juan Sebastian was my RA in Bogota. He did his PhD at Harvard. I supervised his master's dissertation in Bogota. I supervised his PhD dissertation in Harvard, and now he's a professor at the University of the Andes. And he's actually visiting the Becker-Friedman Institute at the moment. So we were just hanging out earlier today. And so this is a topic that I've been fascinated by ever since I started going to Colombia, which is, how does the state actually work in Colombia? Like, how does the state kind of function, and the ways in which this seriously diverges from a kind of Western social science idea of how the state ought to work. And the project is really trying to use Colombian paramilitarism as a sort of as a lens to look at that. Okay, so and I think the way I talk about this, is there's a sort of core and a periphery. In the hegemonic social science tradition, or you could say of Hobbes, and Weber, there's a thing called the state, and Weber defined the state as the entity that has the legitimate monopoly of violence in society in a given territory. So we think about the state, we think about an entity, a bureaucracy, a military. It has sovereignty in a given territory and it controls that territory. But in reality, most states are not like that. I was in Nigeria. I was working in Eastern Nigeria for a month this summer. And I can tell you the state in Nigeria is not like that at all. The places that I was working in, the rural East, the national government does absolutely nothing. There's not one functionary paid by the national government. And if they were paid, it would only be in inverted commas because they never actually received their salary. The society self-organizes. They provide their own public goods. They provide security. They build schools. You want a health center, you have to raise the money. You build it yourself. You maintain the roads. They self-organize. And I think that's the reality in most developing countries. And it's certainly the reality in Colombia. So think of a core. There's a core, there's a kind of place where maybe the state, the modern Western state, does govern and provides public goods. And then there's this far less governed or ungoverned periphery. And in Colombia, that's where you've had all these Marxist guerrilla groups, the drug cartels, the paramilitary groups, which is the main thing we're going to study in this project. So what we're interested in is, and I think that's an equilibrium. It's not that there's a core and there's a periphery, and the periphery, is there's some process via which the core is taking over and sort of gradually, integrating the periphery in. No, it's been like that for 500 years, and the Colombia is a fantastic example for that, because I'll talk more about this later on. But, when President Uribe sort of finally, decided he was going to defeat these Marxist guerrillas, he did that, did in less than 2 presidential terms. Did that lead the Colombian state to kind of expand and integrate the periphery into the core? Absolutely not. The same situation is going on like as ever now. It stabilized the equilibrium. So there's an equilibrium between this core and the periphery. And that's sort of what we're trying to study here. Okay. So in the periphery, the state does few things, provides few public goods, but the periphery self-organizes. Colombians in the periphery provide public goods. They organize collectively. They do things, and in some sense that's what paramilitarism was, as you'll see. And these actors are not really controlled by the state. I'll give you some examples. Of course, they interact with the state. They have connections to the state. The state manages them, and they interface, and they make deals. And so the data we have allows us to see a little bit of that. We're working on that, but you'll see when I get into it how that works. But so think of the core, the periphery. The periphery self-organizes. It provides public goods. It grows drugs. It kills. People get killed, and then there's these interactions between the core and the periphery. And we're interested in sort of studying this self-organization in the periphery, the different forms it takes, the different consequences for the welfare of Colombians living in the periphery, and also the interface with the state. Okay, so here's famously the most paramilitarized town in Colombia, Puerto Boyacá. And here's a expression that I'm going to tell you where all the information is going to come from in a bit. This is a quote that I really like from Ernesto Baez, he's a kind of one of the intellectuals of the Colombian paramilitary movement, you could say. And in a court, he was giving testimony in these transitional justice. Most of the evidence I'm going to talk about comes from transitional justice process in Colombia. And, and he sort of makes this sarcastic remark to the judge: how could a small independent state work inside a lawful state such as ours? So the independent state was the paramilitaries. The lawful state such as ours was the Colombian national state, he's sort of saying exactly what we're interested in. He's saying it sarcastically because he's sort of saying, basically we did whatever we liked and the Colombian government didn't care. And, and how do we think about that relationship? And his testimony is very, very interesting on that. And here's Puerto Boyacá, the land of peace and progress, the anti-subversive capital of Colombia. And welcome to Puerto Boyacá, the anti-subversive capital of Colombia. Okay, so in 2006, Colombian paramilitary groups go back at least to the late 1960s, early 1970s. They self-organize. They spread very rapidly in the 1980s and 1990s. And in 2006, President Uribe kind of managed to get most of them to demobilize. Some of them never demobilized, and they're still operating more or less in the same form But most of them demobilized. And in fact, we have, I'm not going to show you kind of results with that today, but we got all the data from this demobilization. So we have 20,000, we have the information of 20,000 people who entered into this demobilization process. Most of them walked away because they weren't really accused of serious crimes. And about 4,000 of them went into this transitional justice process. And they've been more or less nonstop since 2006, giving testimony about, so in exchange for reduced sentences, they had to kind of tell the truth about how the paramilitaries operated and organized. And a lot of this is about crime and drug production or whatever, but a lot of it, as you'll see, is also absolutely fascinating information about how they organized and what they did. And, you know, that's I mean, it's all in hundreds of thousands of pages, if not millions of pages of court documents. But nowadays, you know, we have things like Python and, you know, so there's lots of ways of dealing with court documents that you didn't have 10 years ago when we started. I don't know, maybe Python existed 10 years ago, but I had no idea what it was. I thought it was a snake, you know. So that's the data. I'll get into like what some of that looks like. You know, it comes from this transitional justice process. And what we're really going to do is, so we're going to have this very rich information about paramilitary groups. There was about 34 paramilitary blocks, and within the blocks there was over 100 fronts. There's missing information, so we don't have information for quite a few of the fronts, but we have over 100 fronts. And we're interested in, you know, in some sense, the variation in how these fronts behaved. You know, did they provide public goods? Did they engage in violence? Did they engage in kind of illegal activities? You know, I've never written a paper about coca in Colombia after all these years, you know, because I always feel there's a great Colombian writer late Colombian writer, R.H. Moreno Duran, who made the very deep remark, I've always thought it's a very deep remark, that in Colombia, politics corrupts drug dealing. Think about it. Politics corrupts drug dealing. So I think that's the right sort of causal arrow. So that's my justification for never writing a paper about drugs. But here it looks a little bit more interesting than I usually think, as you'll see. Okay, so we're interested in how these over 100 fronts behaved. We have enormously rich information on how they were organized, who was in them, you know, what did they do in terms of providing public goods, and I'll give you a reality check on providing public goods in a minute. Violence, you know, they taxed, they provided justice. They were little states. That's what Ernesto Baez said. And they were in some sense, you know, but there's enormous variation in which they operate, in the way in which they operated. And there's enormous variation in the extent to which they were connected with the national state. So in what I'm going to show you today, the main thing of interest is going to be to see, you know, like, how, you know, if we think of more or less connected to the national state, then who, you know, what kind of variation in the way they operate does that cause? Okay, so, and you might think, you know, in some sense, like a natural conjecture would be to say, you know, like ask yourself the question, okay, so these paramilitary groups are kind of organizing, they're taxing people, you know, I'll show you some data on taxation in a minute. They're taxing people, that, you know, they're providing public goods, but there's a lot of differences in the way they're organized. And think of, you know, this axis of some of them are much more connected to the state than others. Why are they connected to the state? Well, they're not really controlled by the state, but quite a few of these fronts were commanded by ex-military officers, for example. So whereas many of them, about 50%, were commanded by, you know, what in Colombia would be called a campesino, like that word, you know, translate. I think it's fairly untranslatable into English. You know, in English you translate that word as peasant, but at least to an Englishman, that really doesn't mean anything. Like there's no such thing as a peasant in England, I don't think. And you know, and it doesn't have the same connotation as campesino does in Colombia. So you know, it's, you know, it comes with a whole package of sociology and kind of values and culture. It's a culture, you know, and which is missing from English. So England or the United States for that matter. I don't think there's any peasants in Illinois. You'd never use that word. It has a kind of very archaic kind of feel to it in English. Or even pejorative, which is not true in Colombia, quite the opposite. It's almost like a badge of honor. You're proud to be a campesino. I'm going to tell you how we measure that. But think of campesinos as people like kind of very disconnected from the state, and think of ex-military officers as people who are connected to the state. So who would you think is more likely to provide public goods, for example? So I think a natural conjecture would be, if your image is, like if you go to the bank, or if you go to like the Ministry of Hacienda, or you talk to some government, some minister in Colombia, they'll sell you the image that, oh, the government is gradually providing public goods and it's extending its scope into the periphery, and so who would you expect to provide more public goods as a paramilitary leader? Well, you think, well, people who are more connected to the state, and so this is in some sense almost like a surrogate expansion of the state. But I would say, based on my experience of doing research in Colombia for almost 30 years, that seriously underestimates, that image, seriously underestimates the scope for extremely perverse interaction between the core and the periphery. So I've done a lot of research on this. We've done research on the impact of paramilitaries on election results, for example. We did work on the so-called false positives. We published a paper last year on the false positives, which was when President Uribe introduced high-powered incentives for the military. The army went up, rounded up civilians, dressed them up as rebel combatants, and assassinated them for pay rises and holidays. So the kind of level of impunity and the sort of perversity of the relationship between the core and periphery, I think, makes this a somewhat naive hypothesis. Okay, and in fact, I personally think the way to think about the relationship between the core and the periphery in Colombia is like, the core thinks the periphery, it needs to be managed, it needs to be pacified. It's a bit like that kind of game whack-a-mole. Do you know whack-a-mole? So if something from the periphery jumps up in your face, you kind of whack it down, but that's kind of all you do. And of course you whack it one down and another one jumps up, but I think that's a good image to think about the relationship between the Colombian state and the periphery. So actually, our working hypothesis, or you could say conjecture, is that it's the opposite is true. Actually, the fewer connections you have to the state and the more isolated from its influence, the more likely you are to actually work in the interests of kind of the average person in the periphery, in terms of providing public goods and being less inclined to use violence, etc. Okay, so you could say that's a conjecture. It's a working hypothesis, and this is a map I like, which I always think this shows you. I call this the political economy of La Voragine, which is it's a fantastic novel from the 1920s, a very famous Colombian novel. So if you want to learn something about the way the Colombian state thinks about the periphery, you should read this novel, The Vortex. The vortex is the periphery. This is a map from a book by the Reyes brothers. So these were late 19th century three brothers, one of whom went on to be the president after the War of 1,000 Days. And you can see this is the way people think about the periphery in Colombia. It's like savages, the skulls and things like this. This is still pretty much how people think about the periphery in Colombia today. If you've read 100 Years of Solitude also, that's a view from the periphery. That's Aracataca, that's up in the Caribbean coast, and that's very much that's the costeño view of the periphery. There's different peripheries, but it's certainly, read it. Yeah. Okay. So what's the sort of, I hate it when people do this. Okay. So what are we going to find? Well, we're going to compare, in the simplest exercise, we're going to compare paramilitary fronts that were commanded by campesinos, let's say, and paramilitary fronts that were commanded by former military officers. Okay, and we're going to investigate what's the consequences of that for public good provision. I'm going to give you some examples of public goods in a second. Public good provision, violence, and illegality. And what we find is that precisely a front which is commanded by a former military officer is less likely to provide public goods more likely to engage in violence, including against civilians, and far more likely to be growing coca. Okay.
Professor,
in contrast,
I'm so sorry to interrupt
yes.
you, but we can't see the slides.
Oh no,
I
you're
think,
kidding me.
no. Could you?
Let me try again.
We could. Sorry about that. We could see your title, but couldn't see as you were advancing the slides. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank
All right,
you.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Let me go back. Nothing is important other than the map of the Reyes, Los Hermanos Reyes. You know,
Yes.
where this is. You know, this map is sort of interesting also because, you know, for those of you, for the connoisseurs of the kind of farcical Colombian state, because, you know, one thing it shows is the project for an intercontinental railroad. You know, so if you study the history of the Colombian state, you know, what's really striking is these endless imaginary plans of how they're going to develop the country and build infrastructure and ports and connect here and connect, and it never happens. You know, it just never happens. So here's the intercontinental railroad, which of course never got built, and, you know, here's the, you know, the skulls. I was trying to point out that this is, you know, this is how this down in the Rio Caquetá. This is, you know, this is the periphery. You know, this is the, it's a jungle out there. Anyway, so I didn't want you to miss that. All right, so the main results, you know, think about the comparison is just going to be very simple. We have in mind complicated econometrics, but we're not there. I'll give you a flavor of that, but we're not there yet. What I'm going to show you some results on is what we find systematically. If you compare fronts that are commanded by campesinos, they're far more likely to provide public goods. They're less involved in violence, and they're less involved in illegality. Okay, whereas fronts commanded by former military officers, and I'm interpreting that as connected to the state, they're much less likely to provide public goods. They're more likely to engage in violence and illegality. There's an interesting sociological story here, I think. You know, I mentioned that campesino is a sort of identity. You know, there's a sociological aspect to it here. In fact, when I was there in 2011, 2012, we did a lot of field work, and we talked to quite a lot of these comandantes, or these paramilitary leaders. And actually, what's really interesting is, like, after you get their kind of confidence a bit, you know, after you convince them you're not a drug enforcement agent and you don't work for the CIA or something like that, and they sort of get, oh, professor, you know, they get who you are and they look at your webpage and they kind of think, okay, that this guy is for real. Then you get them thinking about, you know, you can get them thinking about this. And actually, it's really interesting. They all give these very sociological explanations for why people behaved in different ways. And I think, you know, why are we emphasizing leaders so much here? Well, because these fronts were very personalized, you know. So I think, again, this is sort of based on our field work. You get the sense that what the leader wanted to do, a lot of the variation is being driven at this leader level, that the variation in how these fronts were organized and what they did and how they behaved had a lot to do with the kind of project of the leader. And so I think, you know, there's also, I don't have much to say about that, because it's this sociological aspect of things is difficult to sort of conceptualize with the tools that I have as an economist, but we're thinking about it. I think it's like undeniable in reality, but we're thinking about it. Okay, so I won't talk about the literature. I would tell my students never talk about the literature. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the history of paramilitarism in Colombia. You know, you could tell I'm going to tell a story starting in the 1970s, but of course the history of paramilitarism, if you go back to the 1950s, there was a big civil war in Colombia called La Violencia, and it was full of paramilitary groups all over the place. You know, you could go back even, you know, so there's a long history of paramilitarism. And I think the image you should have in your mind is in the core, you know, there's a core in the periphery, there's all sorts of groups kind of organizing, armed, you know, not armed, collectively providing public goods or security, but also engaging in violence, in illegal activities. And so that, you know, that history is very persistent. You know, I mean, if you can go back, I have one paper where the late colonial period, if you look at the late colonial period, there's very detailed information on where the state was, where state functionaries were, you know, where the population was. And the Colombian Periphery has basically been, it's the same place now as it was in 1794 when that data was collected. So here's Puerto Triunfo. Puerto Triunfo, this is a kind of heart of one of these groups that we did a lot of work, kind of investigated a lot, which is the Autodefensas del Magdalena Medio. So this is a region called the Magdalena Medio. It's down in between the kind of Cordilleras with Bogota and Medellin. It's like near the Magdalena River, and this is where Puerto Triunfo is a municipality where this guy on the right, Ramon Izaza, was from, and he founded this group in 1977. It's an interesting story about connections, because he was a former soldier, but a private, so when I emphasize, military officers, I mean not privates, but military officers, ranking military officers. And in 1977, he was just a farmer, in Puerto Triunfo, and the FARC opened a block, so I'm going to tell you this story just so you get the history of many of these paramilitary groups. The FARC opened a block the FARC was expanding, the Marxist guerrilla group was expanding, and they opened a block in the Oriente of Antioquia, where he was. And they started shaking people down. So they started coming to his farm and asking for money, and he didn't like that. So he went to the local military base at La Dorada and said, look, the FARC are here, give me some guns and some backup, and they told him to take a hike, So he got together with some of his buddies, and they got 10 shotguns. They called themselves los escopeteros, like the shotgunners. And the 10 of them went up into the mountain and figured out where the FARC were and started ambushing them. And then they stole their guns, and then that's how they got going in 1977. So this was really kind of bottom-up collective action, by the periphery. There's disorder, there's the FARC. You've got to provide security. You want to provide public goods. That's how they got going. Okay. The guy on the left, Diego Vecino, he's an ex-military guy. That's a very, so. And here's this is a quote that I like. There's two ways to rule. This is from a demobilized combatant in a book on San Carlos, which is a municipality where there was a famous and horrible paramilitary massacre. There's two ways to rule people: fear or dreams. Okay, and it goes on to say, we chose the former. Fear. So that's you could say public goods or violence. Okay, so by the time they demobilized, whoops, that's another massacre. So this is a map that we constructed basically using testimony from the Truth and Justice law, from the transitional justice proceedings, and we have data of the data is very incomplete on some of them, but like at the maximal amount of data we have would be on 120 different paramilitary fronts, and you can see like color coded here. They sort of spread, they spread all over the place. So some of these, you might think, what's all this, this stripy? Can you see that, Jenny? You can see it when I move my cursor about. Yeah. So, what's all this stripy stuff? Well, that's the same. That's one block. That's a block which was commanded by, Carlos Castaño, who was one of the great entrepreneurs of Colombian paramilitaries, the three Castaño brothers. And they actually had fronts all over the place. They had a front, in Catatumbo near the Venezuelan border. This is where they started in the so-called Bajo Cauca. That's where they kind of got going. That's where they lived in a town called Amalfi. But then they also spread, into Los Llanos, into the eastern plains. So they sent guys there. So they sort of spread around all over the place. Some of the other ones were more kind of compact. These guys here, that Los Buitregueños, they never actually demobilized. So and if you go there, people will tell you they're still running everything. In fact, I won't go into that. So some of them are much more contiguous. Some of them are sort of spread around. And this is kind of at the blocks, and then within that there's all these fronts. So what we're interested in is sort of trying to exploit this front, within front variation in how these people behaved. Okay, this is another very famous massacre in El Salado. So I think I'm going to talk about public goods or whatever, but one should not forget the amount of violence and chaos that went along with all these activities. Okay. So we start with the violence, but what else did they do? Well, lots of dispute resolution, again, public goods. This is the Estatuto. So this is a group from the Magdalena Medio. I showed you Ramon Isaza. So one of the fronts of Isaza he was the commander of this bloc, and he had 6 fronts. And one of the fronts was run by his son-in-law, okay? And this was the Jose Luis Zuluaga front. Okay, and these are the estatutos. This is like the kind of constitution, if you like, of the Jose Luis Zuluaga. Who was Jose Luis Zuluaga? He was the brother of the commander, who was Isaza's son-in-law, who was murdered by the ELN guerrilla group. So a lot of these people had grudges, and that's led them to mobilize, and so this is, I don't want to go into this in details, but there's an ideological platform you can see, and if you read through this thing, it gives page after page of discussion of how you should, what's the objective of the front, how's the front organized, how should the front treat individuals, the front had, so there's a sort of legal code, if you like. The front had a radio station. It was called Integration in Stereo. They even gave out medals. They gave out medals, the Order of Santander, to kind of, people who were outstanding in pursuing the ideological agenda. Well, what was the ideological platform? They were really fighting the FARC. So they got mobilized to fight the FARC and the ELN, these Marxist guerrilla groups. So this is society self-organizing. So why doesn't the government in Bogota do anything about this? Well, they don't need to. They just wait for peripheral society to kind of self-organize, and that contains the problem. Why is it that the FARC went on for so long, with like nobody doing anything about it? Because the Colombian government allows the periphery to self-organize, to contain the problem. And that's absolutely fine. That you only have to do something when things get really out of control. When Pablo Escobar started bumping off presidential candidates, and it spread to Bogota, Luis Carlos Galan was murdered in Soacha, in the south of Bogota, then you hit the panic button and you have to do something about it. But this is fine. This is all going on the main road in between Bogota and Medellin. No one bats an eyelid. It's self-organization of the periphery is containing the FARC, containing the ELN. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to raise taxes. You don't need to provide any resources. You don't need to do anything. Society does it. Okay, so it's like the state free riding off society. We think of people free riding. It's the other way around, in Colombia. Here's some examples. This is from the Magdalena Medio. I could show you lots of data on this, but this is just some sort of reconstruction of their finances. So here's the Frente Jose Luis Zuluaga that I was showing you, their estatutos. This is their spending over the period 2000-2006. That's the kind of period we kind of focus on. So the paramilitaries demobilized in 2006. This is the period for which there's best information. So we kind of focused on this period. There's a lot of flux. These guys started in 1977, but of course they changed their organization a lot over time. So we're not going to be able to keep track of all of that in the empirical analysis. So we focus on this period. So here's the income. Here's the incomes of the Frente Jose Luis Zuluaga. What was their main source of income? $10 million gasoline trade. So there's huge amounts of gasoline smuggling in Colombia. Mostly it comes over the border from Venezuela. So gasoline is almost free in Venezuela, and it's at the world price in Colombia. So there's a huge amount of money to be made by importing gasoline illegally from Venezuela and then selling it. So these guys were on the main road, between Medellin and Bogota. So they would tax this cartel de gasolina, and most of the fronts, these are the other fronts here there were 6 in total, but here's data for 4 of them. There's like $10 million a year. They taxed farms, $700,000. Businesses, they taxed businesses, in the towns where they were controlled. There's some money from coca production, $1 million. So, there's a lot of variation you can see here, even within the fronts. The other ones relied much more than that on this, and there's a lot of variation in total revenues, so this front raised, over twice the revenues of these other fronts, the Celestino Mantilla, for example. And here's what they spent. We have all this detailed expenditure data. So in the transitional justice process, the magistrates and judges were kind of tasked with reconstructing these finances. Again, there's a lot of variation in the quality of information, but here, we know about, salaries, and, in the case of this front, social works. Okay, so they spent $3.5 million, about 26% of their budget on social work. So what does social works mean? Well, let me come back to those characters. Here's a road they built in a municipality called San Francisco, which is kind of a little, east of Medellin, down the mountain. So they built, you can see this road here. They built, this is a road they built. Sonson is the, here's a school, they built a school. This is in the vereda called Piedras Blancas. They built a health center, so this is a clinic they built. So this was from field work. So I think that, of course, you have to check what people tell you. So we went and we did field work here. They built poor people's houses. They built these kind of barrios for people. And in 2006, they all sort of demobilized. I'm going to go back to this slide here. So this is, one thing we have. I'm not going to show you, just give you a flavor of some of the evidence that we have. We have this amazing amount of information on these sort of organogrammas of these different groups. So this is the so-called Bloque Norte. So this is Vicente Castaño. So this is one of the Castaño, the three famous Castaño brothers. I don't know how famous he is, but anyway, here's Mancuso. They all died. They all sort of disappeared. Here's Mancuso. He was extradited. He's now back in Colombia, in Ibagué, feeling sorry for himself. Here's Jorge Cuarenta, like another kind of famous a paramilitary boss, and so this is sort of, now we can go down, to this guy Edgar Fierro Flores. I'll show you his sentence in a minute, and kind of like looking at we have a lot of information on the construction. These are the commanders of the different fronts. Okay, and within the fronts, this is the block that had the most fronts, but within the fronts we know a lot about the kind of how many layers there were, to what extent did Edgar did he delegate activities to other people, or did he try to control everything himself? So we know like the proportion of people that reported directly to him. We also know how much specialization was there. So in the Frente Zuluaga, I talked about quite a bit. For example, there was a separate fiscal wing, there was a separate military wing, and there was a separate political wing. And the people in the fiscal wing were the people who collected the taxes from the farms and the businesses. And they were instructed like never to wear military fatigues. You should always be, tax collectors should be in civilian clothing, because otherwise, people think you're intimidating them. And that's not good. We're not intimidating you. We're providing services and protection. And, you're giving us money to provide these services, not because if you don't give us money, we'll shoot you, So that's the rhetoric anyway. We one of the plans in the future research is we're going to try to exploit the variation in these organogrammas, which is sort of super interesting. So I don't have Cucu Vanoy here, but there was a gentleman called Cucu Vanoy who was a big commander in the Bloque Mineros, and what he was illiterate. And what's interesting about his organogramma is you see, like here, Castaño delegated, to these characters, but Cucu Vanoy, he was illiterate, so he interacted. He had everyone reporting to him, so that's an interesting source of variation. I would say, Mancuso he went to university. These guys were elites. All right, I talked about that. Okay, so the data I sort of I gave you a flavor. Here's Edgar Ignacio Fierro Flores. You saw his mugshot on that previous organogramma. This is his sentence. So these sentences have kind of basically brought out a huge amount of information. What was his delito? What was his crime? Homicidio y otros. So like just to emphasize. There's a lot of violence associated with these characters, even if there might be roads and schools and things like that. So these things are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long, with enormous amounts of information, both about the history of the different fronts, the people in them, the activities, what they did. So we've been basically turning that into a data set. That's the idea. And we can get all sorts of stuff from that. I think I've given you a sort of flavor of it. But we also have data from the University of the Andes, which has a lot of information on violence and conflict, which is data that we've used a lot before in different research projects that I've done in Colombia. And there's data on drugs, because in Venezuela, the Venezuelans think that everything is explained by oil, and Colombians think that everything is explained by coca. But I always tell the Colombians, no, look, the Venezuelans woke up one day and they discovered the oil under Lake Maracaibo. The Colombians never, the Colombians went to Peru and Bolivia and they brought the coca to Colombia, so that's this is what Moreno Duran had in mind. It's kind of, the coca economy is endogenous to Colombian society, and it's connected to this core periphery structure also. Why was it that the Medellin drug cartel, brought all the coca? Because Rodriguez Gacha could build some massive coca plantation, in the east, and runways, and fly it all out, and nobody noticed, nobody batted an eyelid, because that's that's the periphery, that's the vortex. We don't care what goes on there, we don't do anything, and so go for it. Okay, so, and as I said, I give you a flavor. We've done a lot of field work, and it's really many of the hypotheses that we've kind of formulated come from talking to these commanders, and some of them are extremely intelligent and sophisticated, even if they're not educated. All right, so again, so let's go back to the map. I showed you the map before. The oh my gosh, what time should I shut up? I'm talking far too much.
It's okay,
I like talking about.
If you want to go until 5:20, then we can start taking some questions.
All right, so let me. I haven't even got to the econometric model yet. I like talking about Colombia. That's my problem. Yeah. Okay. So I gave you the idea. Let me sort of go through this very fast. So this is just, we can classify these different fronts. We have information into those that were commanded. There's lots of complications here, because some of these fronts had multiple commanders. So you have to make a decision about what we try to do is say, if a front was commanded half the time by a military guy, then we just look at the kind of what was happening in that period. And so that's the simplest way to think about it. But there's a lot of coding decisions here that we're still kind of playing with. And and this is, how do we define what a campesino is? Well, we could do that in different ways. We have a lot of information about people's activities. What job did they have before they went into paramilitarism? What job did their parents have even? Where were they from? And so this is just one cut that's sort of saying, were you born in a municipality which is sort of predominantly rural in terms of the classification in the census? So again, this is sort of spread out all over the place. It's not kind of just clustered in one place or another. There's a lot of variation here, and the different colors represent the fact that, the different proportion of times that a front might have been controlled by a campesino. Okay, so what's going to be interesting from the empirical strategy eventually is that these things have boundaries. So this is just some kind of quotes from, this is if you want to read something about Colombian paramilitaries, then the best book is by Maria Teresa Ronderos, who's actually a friend of the Pearson Institute. She and I gave a seminar about inequality and social mobility in Latin America recently, just a sort of brainstorming between me and her. She's a journalist, very prominent Colombian journalist. She has a wonderful book about Colombian paramilitarism with a title which is very, very, very interesting for the topic of my talk here today, which is Recycled Wars is the title of the book, Recycled Wars. So she points out this immense kind of persistence of conflict and violence, and and how many of these conflicts kind of recur, and that's very much the sort of theme here of the Colombian periphery. Okay, so for the econometricians in the audience, where we're going with this is looking at regression discontinuity analysis using these boundaries between these between these fronts. So we can look at the causal effect of having a campesino commander, for example, or having a former military commander by looking at these kind of boundaries, these relatively arbitrary boundaries. And the assumption here is that, it's conditional on covariates, sorry, putting my econometrician hat on, or my econometrician face mask, conditional on covariates, it's sort of randomly assigned who's in charge of which block or front. And I could talk a lot more about that, but I won't. Okay, so what do I want to say? We have some. I told you what there's lots of statistics now coming, but I told you the basic results. If I show you some regression tables, here's public goods. We can classify different sorts of public goods. I showed you some housing. I showed you a school. I showed you the health clinic in La Danta, the Zuluaga front. What we find is that military people kind of more or less across the board are systematically less likely to provide any public goods, whereas campesinos are systematically more likely to provide public goods. Their fear or dreams. So there's much more fear here, and there's much more dreams here. I think the way we're trying to think about this is, of course, as a social scientist, you're interested in the kind of welfare, of the average person, let's say, kind of utilitarian perspective in the Colombian periphery. But the Colombian elites don't care about that. They're just interested in kind of managing or pacifying the periphery. So it could well be that military people are actually much better for them. It's not really under their control, but from a kind of welfare point of view, obviously, if there's two ways of providing order, you can stopping people join the FARC or the ELN, you can provide public goods, or you can kill people, so you can, like the military are involved in much more violence than the campesinos. Then obviously from a welfare point of view, it's much better to have campesinos organizing these fronts. So I guess, some sense here, the most kind of provocative finding is that the people who are most connected to the state are actually the ones that are providing, much worse governance, in the sense that it's less public goods, more violence, and more coca production. Okay, so far more coca production. So peasant commanders, you saw in that data, there's certainly a bit of income coming in from coca production in the Magdalena Medio, but the average picture is, there seems to be no correlation between coca production and, whether or not you had a campesino in charge of the front. Whereas for the military, there's a whopping effect of ex-military people are much more likely to get into drug dealing. What's the, let me just say, what's the mechanism? I think that's kind of obvious, like the drug economy it's illegal, you have to enforce contracts, you have to punish people who cheat you. The military are much better at doing that, because they're specialists in violence. They're much better at kind of enforcing contracts in this illegal world than some campesinos. It could be that they also have better connections and they know how to get stuff done at the port and things like that, but that could be true. But I think there's lots of reasons why you think a military guy might have a comparative advantage in getting involved in the drug economy too. But so again, more connected to the state, fewer public goods, more violence, more drugs. Okay, so that's, here's my last slide. I think, it's a little bit of data about a big topic, which is, I've been trying for years to kind of understand this equilibrium between how things work in Colombia, how this equilibrium works between the core and the periphery. And I think it is an equilibrium, that's what's so fascinating about this whole experience with the FARC, which is that, the FARC were basically defeated and gave up. But then the equilibrium reasserted itself. What's going on in Colombia now is just absolutely like it always has been. It's the same kind of chaos. And so, this is not like, there's not a sort of Weberian state expanding and waiting to kind of integrate the periphery, but it's not collapsing either. Colombia's been like that for hundreds of years. So it's not like there's state collapse either. That's not the right way to think about it. There's an equilibrium. And the comparative statics of this equilibrium, I guess you could say, can be extremely perverse. The state doesn't do anything unless it really has to sort out a problem, like I mentioned Pablo Escobar earlier. Okay, and it's not that the state lacks capacity to sort the problem out. In fact, when they wanted to sort Pablo Escobar out, they killed him. When President Uribe decided they had to get rid of the FARC, they got rid of the FARC in 5 or 6 years, and the FARC gave up and got nothing in exchange. So there was all this theatrics in Cuba and whatever, but that's the story. That's the big story. They got no political representation. The FARC are history. They gave up their guns. That's it. So it's not that the state lacks capacity. It just has no interest in deploying it in the periphery. Think of that map of the Reyes brothers with the skulls. The periphery is left to organize outside the core. Okay. And I think, we can just say a little bit about that. But, what I got excited, or what we got excited about with this all this information being generated by the truth and justice process, it gives you a window into that. And when we were doing field work, in the Magdalena Media, that's what we all thought. Like, this is like, it's a window into how this whole equilibrium hangs together. And it's only kind of one perspective, but I think it's an interesting perspective. So let me shut up now. You'll realize the University of Chicago professors talk far too much.
Professor, you have a lot of good questions that are coming in the chat that are specific to this, to the presentation that you gave. So okay. Let me just go ahead and pull the first one we have from Pau. Would you consider your approach to research as mixed methods, or are you working mainly with quantitative data and then you kind of talk to people more on the side? So I guess, are you working with this quantitative data and then these conversations you've mentioned are something that happens on the side, or how do you approach that?
No, my training is as an economist. My training, it was actually in economic theory. My early work was all kind of in economic theory, and I think there's a lot of path dependence in academia. Like when you're young, you kind of learn, you learn what a question is and how to answer the question, and once that's in your head, it's very difficult to change. That's my experience. But what I also learned is that economists don't understand anything. When I went to Colombia and I started talking to economists, I realized very fast I don't know anything about what goes on in Colombia. If you want to know what goes on in Colombia, you have to talk to journalists, you have to talk to political scientists, you have to talk to anthropologists, you have to go and ask people and do field work. So I've always felt in my own personal research that I just really haven't, I just don't know enough. You don't know enough and you can't read it. You can't read it in a book. So what do you do then? You could just give up and just kind of go about your business, or you could do what you have to do, if you want to really learn something, So I think the same is true in Africa. I've been working in Africa for 22 years and I just was reading books, reading, and I felt I just didn't understand anything. So that's why, I was in Nigeria for a month in the summer, just working with these Nigerian academics at the University of Nigeria, just doing fieldwork, trying to understand these local political institutions. And yeah, there's lots of wisdom in anthropology about things like that, especially in Africa, not so much in Colombia. But I think but at the end of the day, you come back and you want to construct a data set and you want to test hypotheses, but you don't need to do that. I think qualitative research is fine. You can run any regression you like, but how do you interpret the coefficients? You have to bring all sorts of tacit knowledge and information about the world into the project to interpret the coefficients. The Stata doesn't tell you, that it doesn't give you an output which says, think of it like this. It just says, no, it's 0.25 and the standard error is something.
Professor, another question we have, Kylie is asking, in the late 20th century, were we seeing paramilitary income affect the Colombian GDP?
I don't know about that. There are estimates about, I don't know what there are estimates of how large the drug economy is relative to GDP, but I've never seen anyone look at the paramilitary. One could do that. One could do that, I guess. I haven't thought about it. We could add up, across these fronts, the estimates of what their revenues were. But I hadn't really thought about that. We could probably do it. Yeah, but I have no idea what the answer is. So don't ask.
Professor, there's a number of questions that are coming in about asking about how this research could apply to other countries. So rather than read like 5 different questions, I'll note that some students are asking, is this research or does this apply, or is there a periphery in countries such as Nicaragua, Afghanistan? And then someone is asking, have you looked also at the South Pacific for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, I think there are peripheries. There's certainly a periphery in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My colleague Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, works in the Eastern DRC. And that's certainly, that's very peripheral. There's a periphery in the north of Nigeria. I think in many parts of the world, you have the state has this kind of core periphery structure, and I think Afghanistan is a great example. If you read about the history of Afghanistan, you see there's never been a state in Afghanistan that's controlled, the mountains. Basically, you control the river valleys, or the plains, but no one's ever controlled or taxed or regulated the mountains. So I think that, so I would think that that's a fairly common structure. That being said, there's a lot of variation in the nature of the periphery. And, like in Africa, for example, you'd have, very strong traditional institutions, in a way that you don't have in Colombia, which is a force, for stability in many parts of Africa. So yeah, I think, my idea, this is all about Colombia, but my idea would be that, this is a fairly common organization of states. Yeah.
Another question a student has asked, this is a student from Spain, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anything, but this student asked, let's see, you mentioned it's difficult for economists to incorporate sociological explanations into models, but that some progress could be made. Could you elaborate a bit on this? Do you have any preference among these emerging methodologies? And then the student couldn't help but see some parallelisms between the Colombian core periphery dynamics and the development of mafia in Italy after the Risorgimento. And what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting example of a core, because sort of core and periphery, Sicily or the Calabria or the south of Italy. And I don't know much about Italy, but that does seem like a plausible case. I mean, my comment about, is that, just doing this, talking to these paramilitary commanders in Colombia, they really have this sort of very sociological story about values and this campesino, and they talk about the kind of norms of the campesino, whatever, and but I think it's very hard to give that micro foundations in an economic sense, So if you were going to write down a kind of economic-y type model of what a campesino identity means, I find it very difficult to conceptualize it. Actually, we're having a meeting with Stephen Durluff, who's another of my colleagues here, who's a very distinguished kind of economic theorist, econometrician. But Stephen's also obsessed with sociology. So we've been having an ongoing conversation about how to think about this campesino, like what would a model of that look like? Because I feel like it's definitely here, but I don't know how to conceptualize it, and I think, being in the military also obviously socializes you into a particular way of thinking about the state and society in Colombia. Like Maria Teresa Ronderos, for example, she told me, she interviewed Pablo Escobar and the Castaño brothers, every kind of gangster, that there's been in Colombia in the last 30 or 40 years. And she said, she told me once, the only time she's ever been scared for her life, she's been threatened by all sorts of people. The only time she was ever really got threatened, she really felt in danger, was when she started investigating the military. The military is a very pernicious institution in Colombia, so they kill people, that's also socialization. I don't think that's selection. That's about what they do to you when you join the military. Yeah.
Professor, there are so many other questions, but we're at time, and I want to be mindful of your time and thank you. Those of you who are on the chat, we have some other upcoming events. I mentioned an event that we'll be doing with Alex Carr. The Pearson Institute also Alex shared a link to some of the discussions that happened recently at the forum that could be of interest to some of you. So those are accessible. If you had other interests, you can email Harris Admissions and we can try and direct you to other conversations. But Professor, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. This was really great and lots of really interested students here. So thank you so much.
Okay, yes, so my pleasure, and very nice for everyone to tune in, and look forward to meeting you all in Chicago, in sunny Chicago.
Thank you so much, Professor. Have a good evening.
Okay, bye-bye.